I've been doing software-based algorithmic experimentation for actually 3 or 4 decades. The last decade, I've been doing the stuff I'm going to talk about today. One phrase that I use a lot is casual instruments, which is the intention is to be very analogous to casual games, which people may be more familiar with. Very simple games that people play with on the iPhone or whatever, with a simple mechanic, so almost no learning curve, but then they can immediately have a lot of fun. So my goal with what I call casual instruments is the same thing, but in a musical and a visual way, so that somebody can walk up to the instrument without knowing anything and immediately start having fun. And entertainment is perhaps, if there's one word, entertainment is the goal, as opposed to being anything else. So I'll differentiate between casual instruments and performing instruments. And then over the last decade or so, new sensors, new devices have become cheap enough and readily available, and that's a very rich resource for developing the kind of things that I develop. And then I'll go into the different versions of the space palette. So as I was saying, casual instruments, very simple, discoverable. So the ideal is that there's no instructions at all. So you give somebody a drum and start striking it, you don't need any instructions beyond that. So that's the ideal. But the goal is that every person sounds different, so they can immediately imbue your own personality to it. But at the same time, the ideal is that it be have a lot of depth to explore. One way I do that with the space palettes is by having lots of presets with different types of sounds. So there's lots of different things to explore, and every one has a different style and different things to discover. So in contrast to casual instruments, performance instruments, it can be the same piece of hardware. In fact, that's one of my goals, is that the same hardware can serve as a casual instrument. That's the primary initial goal. But just by changing the user interface on the touchscreen in this case, you can change it to much more of a performing instrument that requires training or instruction to get more things that you would want to do during a performance. In fact, this keyboard is one example. I can add a keyboard to this to give me more control over the scales and things, whereas with the typical casual instrument deployment of this, I don't have the keyboard. So same physical interface can serve both, and you can switch on the fly. There's a secret gesture on the touch screens that can switch between the casual mode and the performance mode. So I'll just give a few examples of the kind of instruments I've created leading up to the space palette. Dance pads is one example of a input device that is used for games and so on. Just dance on these dance pads. So it became very easy to interface those to a computer and use those as the primary input device. So here I'm dancing on these dance pads, and I've got a wireless QWERTY keyboard hung around my neck that's changing things on the fly. So in 2002, I went to Burning Man for the first time, which completely changed my life in many ways. And I call it the world's largest uncurated art gallery. So there's infinite space. You don't have to worry about finding a gallery, a place for your art. So you don't have to market your art or anything. You can just work on your art, and then here's a free, infinite space gallery to deploy what you've created. So that's, and commercialism is completely, not outlawed per se, but not present. So the lack of commerce is a big part of it. So in 2003, I took those dance pads that I've been using on my own and created what you might call a casual instrument. So there's two pads there, and this big lyre has rope lights, and so they light up corresponding to the notes that are being played. It's just like a big harp that you're playing. You didn't actually pluck the strings, although people, they would often come loose because people would try to play them. So around the early 2000s, there was this these pads called the Fingerworks pad that was capacitive, very sensitive, multi-touch. It was one of the first readily available, relatively cheap, multi-touch things you could buy. And so I started experimenting with those, and they were XY like a mouse pad, but it also detected the area of your finger. So that you smush your finger down more, there's more area of your finger. So that's the third dimension. It wasn't pressure, it was the area of the finger. So that was my first exposure to a three-dimensional input device that is supernatural to use. Finger area isn't quite as nice as pressure, but it's close. And so this device was so good that unfortunately Apple bought the company and took it off the market, so you could no longer get it. But I had enough of them and had fun experimenting. And this was in 2009. This is my biggest thing out in the middle of the playa. It was the 2001 Space Odyssey monolith. And so one side of the monolith had this super complicated musical instrument, and the other side had a blackboard and chalk. So it was two sides, musical on one side, super complicated musical on one side, and super simple visual on the other side. So that it was battery powered, so had to change the batteries every day. Burning Man has very interesting logistical challenges, engineering challenges, which can be interesting and a part of the stuff you have to do. And it can be very interesting learning how to do things. Like in this case, I didn't want guy wires holding down the monolith, but there's 85-mile-an-hour winds out there, and you can imagine a flat surface like that. You need to support it well. So I went to a structural engineer to figure out what kind of supports to put in the ground to support it without guy wires.
So what was it? What did you do? What did you end up?
Oh, it was like an inverted T. So just going down a couple inches, and made out of steel. So two of those on either side, and then 4-foot rebar going down. So the forces, and then between the support and the 4x4 wood that was the main vertical thing, there were like 9 huge bolts between the wood and the metal. So the structural engineer told me that's what was needed. And so
it didn't blow over.
It didn't blow over. It wasn't challenged, the interesting thing is in 2012, which actually you'll see a video, I turned the pieces of this into a projection screen to project video on, and it could still withstand the wind forces. So these are internals. So these are trigger finger pads, a commercial drum pad kind of thing, and then 2 of these Fingerworks things. So it was basically 2 5-track MIDI loopers.
Synced?
Yeah, they were definitely synced. In fact, the whole thing was running battery powered on a very small computer, DC powered. Burning Man and creating these things, you get into all sorts of interesting engineering challenges to run it off battery, for example, and so on. Some of you may be familiar with the Linstrument. Roger Lynn, who created the first sampling drum machine, he has developed this this controller called the Linstrument, which it's like a grid. There's lots of grids out nowadays, but this is like a horizontal grid. But the buttons are very sensitive and they're three-dimensional. So I created what might be more is a different instrument, basically triggering notes in a looping pattern, and the notes are triggering graphics at the same time. The first thing that combined visuals and music in a single casual kind of instrument. So that we had at Burning Man in 2016. So I've talked about three-dimensional input, which is one of the things I've wanted to explore over the last decade in a variety of ways. And you can use that third dimension in somewhat natural ways, like graphically, the harder you press, or that third dimension can be the size of graphics. Musically, you can add vibrato or filter. So that third dimension can be used in direct, understandable ways. You can also use it in other ways. So it's lots of interesting potential, and over the last decade or two, there's a variety of different sensors that have been released that let you get a third dimension. One of the interesting ones is the Leap Motion. So basically there's a camera down here that's watching your hand. It's very essentially hard-coded to hands, but it's incredibly accurate. And you'll see in a second, I'll start using multiple fingers. There's a couple things going on here. What I'm doing at the moment is using that keyboard to control the scale that I'm playing with that one finger. And then in a second I'll be using multiple fingers and you'll get chords. And it's three-dimensional. It's tracking your fingers and it's giving you X, Y, and Z. So X, Y, and Z for every finger with extreme precision.
Z is volume?
Z, well, it depends. In this case, yeah, it was mostly volume.
Z is movement front and back. I understood that.
Yeah.
It was controlling the volume.
Yeah, very much. And this is just an initial experiment with it. The challenge with this particular camera, it's tuned specifically for hands, but the area is kind of fuzzy on the edges. So creating a understandable instrument would be challenging, but amazing device. In fact, they just came out with a new version of it that's a little higher resolution. And there's other cameras. The Kinect is the one that's being used in the middle space palette. I call it the Space Palette Classic. So that's a three-dimensional camera that gives you a depth map. So it gives you, an image where you've got pixels. Every pixel has a color, but every pixel also has a depth associated with it. So that makes it easy to ignore your body when it's further away from the plane of the space palette there. So the Kinect made this kind of instrument possible when previously, it just wasn't possible without a depth camera. So the Kinect was quite a breakthrough. It was actually the fastest selling consumer product of all time at the time. But it's no longer, it was kind of a flash in the pan. But it exposed this third dimension. And there's lots of other cameras now that can do the same kind of thing. And then the last one was the Sensel Morph, which is what's used in the latest Space Palette, which is called the Space Palette Pro. So back to when I first started a decade ago with the Kinect, the camera-based one, these were the initial prototypes. So I wanted to provide more control rather than just doing a full body thing without any guidance. So almost immediately I went to this frame approach using just picture frames, and it gradually evolved to this oval shape. So this will explain things.
So this is the space palette. Each of the four big holes is where you play, just by waving your hands. In addition to being a 2-octave keyboard musically, it's also a 3-dimensional mouse pad like you're finger painting, and that's what's producing the graphics that you see. Each of the big holes is a separate sound and a separate shape. And you see the further in, it's all 3-dimensional because of the Kinect camera. It's able to tell me how far away the hands are. Any number of hands will work. And then the little holes are like buttons that let you change the sounds and the graphics. The one additional detail is that if you're down toward the bottom of a hole, it's quantizing notes to quarter notes, the middle to 8th note, and the top to 16th note. So if you wave your hands, you get a nice variety of timing, so that contributes to the musicality of it. The other thing is that all the notes are forced onto a given scale. So basically, no matter what you do, it sounds musical, but you're still in control of the notes. There's no pre-recorded loops or anything. So you're playing low notes here, high notes here. So you've got 4 different instruments, 2 octaves of each, and you can do whatever you want to.
So that's the basic, the vertical dimension where you're going down to the bottom of the hole, you have slower notes, top of the hole, faster notes. I call those time frets. And it's very analogous to on like a guitar, you've got frets on a guitar are quantizing your pitch. So time frets is just the same thing, but you're quantizing the timing of the notes that are coming out. So that in that same technique, where it got X is pitch, Y is the time frets, and depth is either graphically it's larger things, or musically it can be a filter or volume. That same approach is used in these pressure-sensitive pads. And the only difference is that rather than depth of your hand being that third dimension, it's pressure of your fingers. So with that frame, you get a lot more control, and also you can tell what tell what you're doing, and also people observing you can tell what you're doing. And because it's large, large movement is more entertaining or more enjoyable than small movement. It's also more entertaining for people watching it. So over the last decade, I've been to Burning Man many times and other festivals like Lucidity, Northern Nights. So it's been enjoyed at a lot of them. And this is 2012 was the coming out party, if you will, of it. And so this video. Possible to turn these lights on? So I don't know if you could understand a few seconds before this last scene, the guy said it really opens up what an instrument is, something like that. And it really interesting and somewhat rare to have somebody describe it so perfectly in terms of what Michael is. And then yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's right. And then the last guy, exhibits the kind of enthusiasm that people have when they encounter this thing, and it's very enjoyable to watch people play it, both as the creator, of course, and getting feedback and see what works and what doesn't. But it's also enjoyable to observe other people observing it and waiting to see that first reaction when they first start playing it and realizing what it is. This man burning on Saturday night, and somebody's still playing it. It's large enough that multiple people can play together. Dust, the Kinect, works wonderfully even So sunlight, sunlight, at least direct sunlight, screws up the Kinect because the Kinect uses infrared light. So it really only works at night. It's amazing. It was still working in daylight there. Okay, so its primary focus from day one was as a casual instrument that people could just walk up to. As a performance instrument, just by itself, it has advantages or pluses because it's larger, so it's more engaging to watch and so on. But its primary focus has always been as a casual instrument. Is that the large movement's enjoyable. In the 2013, I had smaller space palettes, 4 smaller ones, as an experiment. And what I found out was that the oval was about this big as opposed to this big. And what I found out, realized after the fact, was that doing this kind of motion with your hands isn't nearly as much fun and enjoyable as doing this. So I haven't used those small palettes anymore, but the big one did a real sweet spot. So there's challenges about trying to make use of three-dimensional input. I mean, the goal of that frame is to give you a little more control. So you have separate three-dimensional surfaces, three-dimensional mouse pads in midair, gives you more control. You don't have any tactile feedback, so that's, but it also, people are often hesitant to touch things. I have to be trained to use it, or so this, you don't touch anything, so it's a little easier to get people to play with it. There was one guy at Burning Man that stood back watching people play it, and his question was, how do they know where to put their hands? It was so ingrained that a musical instrument, you have to learn how to play it. And here was something that you don't have to learn how to play it. You just start dancing with your hands in front of it and listen and watch. So it was. He's the only person that's really been reluctant to dive in. So to get a little geeky, this is the internal structure of the software. So the Kinect puts out an image where every pixel is a depth value. So this program converts that into XYZ for your hands or cursors. And that goes into Resolume, which is a program used by VJs as a host for visual plugins. Somewhat strangely, I used a visual plugin to generate MIDI as well. And that is a browser interface. So I'm a software developer by profession, so I enjoy the process and exploration of developing software.
So Tim, you're saying the graphics is what generates the MIDI?
No, both the XYZ of your hands, it's basically going in 2 directions.
Oh,
One is, they're independent. In this original software, they were independent, but they were both being done in the same
Okay.
plugin inside Resolume.
Okay, thanks.
So there's just more details about the internals. And I've open sourced almost everything I've done.
Do you have to calibrate it for every setting, adjust settings, or is it pretty plug and play?
It's pretty. Once you set it up, when you first install it, you have to tweak where it thinks that plane is for the frame. So there's some adjustment there. But the goal, and it'll run for, it was in the Tech Museum in San Jose for about 6 months. So it runs by itself, doesn't require any maintenance, or that's the goal anyway. So after the Kinect and, the original Space Palette hit a real sweet spot, but then the Sensel Morph came out, and they had a Kickstarter and started producing them. And for me, it was absolutely a dream come true, as a next step. So it's like a mouse pad, but it's multi-touch, multiple fingers, and pressure sensitive. Unlike the Fingerworks pads in the early 2000s, which were finger area, the Morph is finger pressure, which is much more natural.
And that's the one that is in place on those.
Yeah, so 4 of them in each of them. So I call it the Space Palette Pro. So the Morph was marketed as a MIDI controller, which kind of throttles the incredible data that it can put out. But there's a market there, and it's a niche market. They had to find somebody to sell it to, and so they marketed it as a MIDI controller. And it's the pads you see there are featureless, but they have these overlays that can essentially put different layouts of buttons and sliders on them, and these overlays have magnets in them, so it can tell which overlay is on it at any given time. So it's a really interesting, MIDI controller that's quite flexible in the MIDI world. For me, I prefer not having an overlay, so because it's about the size of your hand. So, and if you're finger painting, it's just nice to have an unencumbered space for finger painting. And it's also very thin, so it was very easy to incorporate it into a physical frame, like as I've done. And so I went off learning how to do CNC stuff at some of the local maker shops. So I've open sourced all the CNC data for this, so if somebody wants to produce their own, they can. The biggest problem is that these pads aren't made anymore. You can buy them on reverb.com. They've gone down to about $400 a piece. But because of my previous experience with the Fingerworks, when the Morph came out, I didn't want the company whether the company went out of business or not, I wanted to have a lot of them, so I started collecting them. So I have quite a few of them, especially because I'm using them 4 at a time in these instruments. So, as I said, the heuristics of the layout, what X, Y, and Z do is very similar to the previous one, except rather than 1 3-dimensional cursor per hand, you've got 5 3-dimensional cursors per hand. So, because every finger is, an independent cursor that's generating both sound and visual. So you have a lot more control that way, and then because it's pressure and you're touching it, it's a different experience, and it can be more satisfying because you're touching something. So there's pros and cons to all of these things, which are interesting to explore. And then internally, I started using Go as a new programming language that I like a lot. So if anybody's interested in the internals, I'm happy to go into that. And another difference between the previous one and the latest one is that previously the graphics just had 1 layer. You had 4 shapes, if you will, but the visual effects were common among all 4. And in the new one, each one of the 4 paths has a completely independent visual pipeline. So the layering and the complexity of the graphics you're getting are a lot more variety and visual interest. So the graphical interface on the touch screen has gone through a few iterations. And as I mentioned previously, I can essentially change it from a casual instrument to a performing instrument just by changing the user interface on the touch screen. So the interface, the normal interface, this is the first version, but the normal casual interface when I deployed at Burning Man and elsewhere is just simple. You have presets, every preset changes all 4 paths, and you may have a little control over looping. But even looping can get confusing because people, they may not understand that what they're hearing is what they played, being looped. So whether to include looping or not is an important decision. If the goal is a purely casual instrument that can be as, doesn't confuse people. So this would be the casual GUI, and this is the more performing one that lets you get independent control over the 4 paths. So each one you can control independently, whether it's looping or so on. So that was the first iteration. And this is the 3rd iteration, which is fairly similar to what the current one is. So from the same interface, there's a secret gesture that'll get you into the more advanced mode that lets you get detailed control over all the parameters and so on. So you can be modifying those things while you're playing, which is appropriate for a performance instrument. And the other change I mentioned that you saw in the leap motion thing, if I have a keyboard here, rather than having a fixed scale, whatever chord or whatever set of notes I play on this keyboard, that's the notes that I'm strumming essentially on these pads. You can think of these pads kind of like an invisible harp. You're strumming an invisible harp. So this was in 2019. They had both the original classic Space Palette and the new one, both in one installation. And that same year, there's this big pyramid at Burning Man called the Ply Alchemy Pyramid. And I just somewhat randomly got an opportunity to bring my Space Palette over and use their projectors and project onto this. It was a 70 foot high pyramid. The sound wasn't connected to anything, so it was basically just a visual instrument.
This is wonderful. It is 7:45. I don't know if you want to make time for a demonstration or some
Yeah,
questions.
I think in fact, I think this is the last.
Ooh, stunning.
So that, so there's lots of, future exploration, two-handed interfaces and so on. If you're familiar with the Sonic Runway, this was a piece of Burning Man that's now in San Jose, right in front of City Hall, called the Sonic Runway. So it's basically these rings of LEDs. So actually this last week, as an initial experiment, we connected up the Space Palette controller to the Sonic Runway.
How?
How? In software, using NDI.
Okay, and they have a physical input that is what's standard.
Well, I had to work with the developers of the Sonic Runway. So their software is written in Touch Designer, and it's very easy in Touch Designer to take video input over NDI, which is a protocol, and Resolume puts out NDI. So it was very surprisingly easy to connect the two. What these rings look like to the software is a video screen, and it just happens to be 25 by 532 pixels. So
25?
yeah, so 25 is the number of rings,
Oh.
and 532 is the number of LEDs on a given ring. So if you can generate a 25 by 532 video image, you can display it on the Sonic Runway. Okay, so let me. Let's see, just gonna get a clean start here. For a few seconds, any questions?
We were talking about the performance instrument versus. So, have you gotten really good as a performer?
Well, I've gotten better than somebody who hasn't played it. But as far as enjoying it, so it's not you can be very expressive with the casual instrument. If you get used to it, particularly every preset on there has sweet spots of playability that you can discover. So you can get very good at playing specific presets,
Okay.
and because the pressure sensitivity is so great, you can get really good. So I'm as good as anybody else with that. And it's endless. I mean, I find it's somewhat rare for me to develop something and then enjoy continuing to use it. You just get tired of, because there's not a lot of depth, if you will. But the Space Palette has so much depth and so on that I never get tired of playing it.
Yeah.
So that's one interesting aspect. Performing wise, well, let me just do a short performance here. So basically, I'm just going to cycle between various presets.
time for questions.
Well, you know, aside, it's always me. One thing you didn't talk at all about And you could probably spend another, it's probably too long to get into now, but you didn't talk at all about the sort of compositional process of how you decide the mappings.
Which map?
Meaning, what gesture translates into what sound. And
Well, in some sense, in some very sense, I don't think there are any gestural mappings at all, other than the pitch. There's 3 mappings of X, Y, and Z. So I don't treat gestures by themselves. I mean, you do a gesture and it happens to produce a visual trace,
Yeah.
but my software doesn't recognize the visual trace. You produce the visual trace by doing a gesture. My software only knows about points and so on. So the mapping, if you will, is very intentionally straightforward, or it intends to be straightforward. Pitch, left to right,
Yeah.
like a piano, which is debatable by itself. Some people think pitch, the Y dimension should be pitch. So even a simple mapping is interesting. But you've got, so pitch horizontally, you've got time frets vertically, and you've got depth, which is size of visuals, or and sonically it's vibrato or a filter or a volume. That's the extent of the mapping.
And you're not at all tempted to sort of say, gee, I could be a composer, I could do this, that. It sounds as if you're really more interested in.
Well, I'm interested in creating casual instruments for other people to play. The interesting thing is, there's 2 parts to composition. One is, or I don't know if it's 2 parts, but I think you've got 4 instruments at your disposal, at your immediate disposal. So you're orchestrating 4 different instruments at once. So I definitely think of it as 4 different instruments, and playing it, you're orchestrating whether you realize it or not. You're choosing, which instrument to play at any specific point. So you're composing by choosing which instruments to play at any instant. So I consider that, improvisation.
Yeah.
Improvisation is just composing really quickly, or vice versa. Composing is slow improvisation.
But at least, I'll say one more thing in defense of this perspective, which at least you're deciding interesting timbres. Somehow you're coming up with these.
So yeah, that's a very good point. So the reason why this hits a sweet spot and I think works well is the curation of the presets. So, and there's 2 aspects of that. One is I use Omnisphere, which is a sound module which has incredible sounds. So I don't have to be searching around with lots of different plugins. So I've chosen one plugin that has a ridiculously great set of sounds, but now I have to curate which ones I attach to the presets. And so the goal of most of the presets is to create 4 instruments, visual music instruments, where they complement each other. Either they're all percussive, or so the curation, and that takes that's a lot of effort. So it's essentially creating, like, there's 30 presets here. Each one has 4, so there's 120 decisions I need to make on which sound to use and scale. I mean, I could do other things, but and that curation is takes a lot of effort, and people don't. It's definitely one of the hidden things that makes this as deep, and it's deep because there's so many instruments at your disposal, and they're all curated, by me.
Right. I mean, I'm inclined to give you a little more credit than you're giving yourself. You're using this word curated. It's a good word. I see what you're saying. I agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot goes into creating these worlds that are a little more than you're giving yourself credit for.
Yeah. So it's a half. So the first half is the physical interface, and these pads are just, key. A 3-dimensional input device is key to what makes the things I play with, the things I want to play with. And the second half is the curation of the presets. Yeah. So there's definitely 2 major halves.
Do you tweak the presets?
Oh, continuously.
The Omnisphere, so it's the Omnisphere, you're able to edit the presets or create your own sounds, I suppose.
Well, because it's such a rich source of sounds, they've curated the sounds. So the basic sounds are, I don't play with them, but what I do play with is the number of voices. So if you have only one voice and you play something, each new note will terminate the previous one. Whereas if you, so the number of choosing how many voices that the preset has available is key to how the preset plays. So the playability of things is definitely controlled by a few of the parameters in Omnisphere. So I do tweak a few of those, but I don't create new sounds per se. It's basically.
And it has, how do you get input from all 10 fingers? And can you do all 10 on one pad?
Oh yeah. There's no.
Can you do more than 10?
Yes.
Can you do an infinite number of fingers?
Well,
Okay.
it's not enough.
Yeah, probably enough.
So these pads have a C API that is phenomenally good. It gives you the raw data from the pads. It's something that Apple and maybe other companies as well, but Apple does not give you raw access to the sensors in the devices they sell for a variety of reasons. Some of them good, but for me, I want access to the raw data, whatever the device is capable of putting out. And MIDI only exposes, a fraction of what I think these devices are capable of generating. Unfortunately, they have an API that lets you get access to the raw data. So you can put 20 fingers down and it's telling you, giving you 20 XYZ values.
Yeah, so for me, the elephant in the room is that both these visuals and sounds seem to me like they would blend very nicely with festival drugs. I wonder if you can speak to your experience of those interactions, or how you've intentionally leaned into that.
Well, I hear a lot. I mean, there's comments, I had a slide in longer presentations, a slide with sayings that I've heard over and over again. So I'll say a couple of those before getting to that one. So it's just amazing, especially the first few years. I want one in my living room. Literally those exact words repeated, many times. How much? They want to buy one. Unfortunately, my focus is not to sell them, so it'd be nice. So how much? I forget what the other ones, but another one that I've heard a fair amount is that people don't need drugs. The visuals and the immersiveness of the experience is so direct and immediate, and that you're attached, and you're attached to both the sounds and the visuals simultaneously, all under your control. That is, I don't know of any other experience where there's that direct and the connection to everything that's happening, and that the graphics are intentionally, psychedelic stuff. So I've heard a fair number of times that, I don't need acid on this. So on the other hand, I'm sure I've never tripped on it. Not that I haven't wanted to, just haven't. There was one time at Lightning in a Bottle, there was a guy who was just tripping his ass off, and he was standing, this is the classic space palette, so he was standing there with his hands in the two big holes, and he just stood there, and there was a setting, you noticed at the end I was using the moire, lots of thin lines, and there are lots of overlaps, and just endlessly interesting patterns in moire stuff. And you just have to vary stuff very slightly, and you just endlessly, and this guy was taking advantage of that. He literally stood there like this on that kind of setting, and it's just constantly undulating stuff. Literally for, I think it was close to a half hour. I tapped him on the shoulder. He was tripping his ass off. He actually growled because he didn't want to be disturbed. So, and I, loved the fact that he was enjoying it so much, and I was not about to try to push him away. Sometimes when people are playing it for 10 minutes, and there's a line of people wanting to play it, I will you know, gently, or and actually a lot of times they'll be playing it for 10 minutes or whatever, and suddenly they look around and there's a crowd of people there, and they're surprised because they were just so into it. So sometimes I'll tap them on the shoulder, you know, let them know. But this guy, no way was I going to interrupt his experience.
Has anyone ever knocked it down because they were so excited, or?
Well, you notice there's some supports on the side, so it's pretty sturdy. People have tried to like dance in the middle, so but that doesn't give you the control. But people have definitely tried it at Maui. People were juggling balls behind it. The other story of Maui that's interesting is because the Space Pilot Classic is big, you can you stand side by side with somebody. So you're playing one thing and they're playing it, and you can jam together. You can trade fours if you're familiar with that musical phrase. So you can jam together very easily, rhythmically. And so at this Maui festival, I was jamming with this woman. She's standing next to me. For 5 minutes, we were jamming back and forth, trading fours, you know, having a musical conversation, a real musical conversation. At the end of 5 minutes, I was, you know, I was sworn up and down that she was a musician of some sort. So I asked her, what instrument do you play? And she said she'd never played an instrument before. So I think it reveals that when you enjoy music and you've listened to a lot of music, you start internalizing some musical behavior, musical aspects. And you know, you haven't spent the time to learn an instrument, but you know those aspects. And if you're presented with an instrument that has as shallow learning curve as possible and lets you access, you know, under your control, so you're not thinking, you're just connecting to your inherent, the musical instinct you've built up just by listening to music and enjoying it. So,
How large does the Kinect allow you to make that controlling area? To make it body size and be able to dance in it and control it? Or?
It might be a little challenging to do one Kinect. You could certainly do multiple Kinects. It is an interesting aspect of that frame layout, the layout of the holes. I actually wrote the software so you could train it on any layout of holes, because I wasn't sure what layout I would want, even though I ended up with one that works. A guy, one of the few people who've taken that software and trained it on a different layout, I think it was heart-shaped or something. So I wrote the software to be flexible in terms of the layout of the holes. But for one Kinect, that's a pretty good size, especially because the Kinect really is only 320 by 240, so it's in-depth information. So it's surprisingly low resolution, but also surprising that in spite of that low resolution, you can create something that's pretty responsive.
Well, thank you, Tim. This has been wonderful. The show will be up through the end of August, so let people know to come by and check it out. It's open during the daytime from 9 to 5 and half an hour before shows start, and during intermission at shows. So check out the shows that are upcoming. Thanks so much, Tim.